Hey everyone, my name is Caden. Some of you probably know me by my screen name Nova Wolf. About 3 years ago, from February to September of 2021, I worked for the YouTube channel Jelle's Marble Runs, which makes marble-themed spin-off of sporting competitions like the Olympics, Formula One, and more. My position within the company was graphics producer, which meant I was responsible for creating all of the motion graphics that were included in the channel's Marble League 2021 series. Today, I wanted to take a moment and talk about what happened. Talk about everything that happened, at least what's relevant to my story. First, because I've kept a lot of the stuff to myself for the past 2.5 years and haven't had the opportunity to really talk about some of it. And second, because I think the things I dealt with during that time are still relevant today, especially for anyone who would consider working for the channel in the future. I think it's safe to say that how things ended up going during the 7 months I worked for JMR was wildly different from what I had expected when I accepted the graphics role. This time ended up being one of the most tumultuous periods in the channel's history, with the internal structure of the channel being shaken up quite drastically in the months leading up to Marble League 2021. I'm going to be highlighting those events as well, since they were very influential on my working environment. I'll also touch on some of the difficulties I had working with certain people in the channel. I don't want this video to take on an overly negative tone and excessively focus on the bad actions of others, but again, it is highly relevant to my work, and I think something that's worth discussing regardless. In this video, I'll be giving a chronological account of my experience working for Jelle's Marble Runs, starting with the lead up to me getting into the graphics role, progressing through the entire time periods prior to and during Marble League 2021, and I'll conclude this video with some of my retrospective thoughts on everything that happened. So, let's get started. I was first introduced to JMR in 2017, when I was recommended the qualifiers video for the 2017 Marble League, or Marble Olympics at the time. I ended up subscribing to the channel and watching all of their Marble Olympics videos. Then, in 2019, I discovered the channel's fan communities and joined the Discord and subreddit, and I immediately became pretty active in both. I became involved in a lot of community projects, such as Project Canon, the Library of Marble Sports Lore that ended up becoming Marble Earth, and the Monthly Marble, which was a JMR-themed magazine that ran publications throughout 2019. In 2020, I continued to be active in the community as it underwent a tremendous amount of growth due to the exposure the pandemic brought toward the channel. By this time, I had taken a couple high school classes in graphic design, and I used those skills for my classes to begin designing graphics for the community, which were some of my highest regarded work at the time. In late 2020, I was invited to the Jelle's Marble Runs Committee, which was a group of community members entrusted to work directly with the channel, helping with the production of videos and serving as advisors for the series the channel produced. By this time, the committee had been running strong for almost 2 years, and it had helped transform JMR from a small, family-run operation into a legitimate production company for Marble Sports. I really didn't have a specific role when I first joined the committee, but I found a few ways to contribute to their work. I created race lineup graphics for Marbula 1 Season 2 races, and I also helped in the collection of data used to create the position towers for the races. At the time, the graphics were done by an individual by the name of Tom, also known by the screen name Fukov. Then, as 2020 came to a close, there were two significant developments within the committee that were especially impactful for me. The first was the announcement of the Marble League Winter Special, a mini-series that would be released in January 2021. This series was announced with relatively little warning, even to us in the committee, but it would be my first opportunity to help with the production of a Marble League series, even if it was only 5 events. The second development was Tom announcing that he was planning on retiring from the committee in early 2021 and resigning his duties as graphic producer. That meant the graphics producer position would be vacant for Marble League 2021, and I identified that as an opportunity for me. There had always been a part of me that wanted to make the motion graphics for a series like the Marble League, and I figured if I could produce some graphics for the Winter Special series, I could prove myself as a worthy successor to Tom once he stepped down. Now, fortunately, there was one event in Winter Special that seemed like the perfect opportunity for me to add an idea of my own, and that was ice hockey. This event had been done before, and I felt like the biggest thing it had been missing was a live scoreboard that showed the number of goals scored during the match. Instead, there was just a results graphic at the end of each match. So, I spent most of my winter break learning Adobe After Effects and how to make motion graphics. Ultimately, I was able to produce a proof of concept that was received really well by the committee, and I had the green light to produce scoreboards for all of the matches in that hockey event. Due to some of the difficulties filming the event, I ended up having much less time to create them all than I expected, but I was ultimately able to get them all done, and the result was phenomenal. I was really pleased with how they looked, and a lot of people in the community were quick to acknowledge how much the scoreboards enhanced watching the event. This made me really confident in my abilities as a graphics producer. However, after that video was released, the head of the JMRC, Anton, aka Melikus, informed me that graphics production for JMR videos would be restricted to paid contractors and not handled by committee members, which meant that if I wanted to continue making graphics for the videos, I had no choice but to go after the graphics producer position that would soon be opening up. To say that I was ambitious to go after the graphics producer job when I did would probably be an understatement. I was a 17-year-old kid in his junior year of high school with absolutely no prior work experience in that field. The only job I'd ever had up to that point was working at a fast food restaurant. I also knew that the JMR community had extremely high expectations for all of the things people made for the videos, and Jelle wanted only the highest quality of work included in his creations. I had to spend a few days thinking about taking on the position and everything it would entail, at least everything I could think of the time, and convince myself that I could handle it all. Fortunately, one strength I've always had is being very confident in myself, and I also had a strong desire to escape the miserable fast food job I was working at the time. So, on February 7th, 2021, I worked up the courage to send a message to Anton, expressing my interest to fill the graphics producer position after Tom resigned from it. His response ended up being much more positive than I could have expected. He was completely on board with the idea, told me no one had filled the position yet, and that I should contact Jelle as soon as possible to see if we could reach an agreement for me to work for the channel. This was just such an exciting moment for me. The prospect of me getting paid to work for my favorite YouTube channel seeming like it could become reality. But first, I had to reach an agreement with JMR, so I immediately reached out to Jelle on Facebook Messenger to get in contact with him. While I waited for him to respond, I went back and forth thinking about what I should ask for, mainly in terms of pay. I knew I wasn't going to be setting a very high cost for my services, partly because I had no prior experience and it didn't feel right to charge an industry standard rate because of that, and partly because I got the impression the channel wouldn't be able to pay at that rate anyways. Tom was kind enough to tell me about the deal he had made with the channel and what he was paid, and that helped me give an idea of what offer I should make to Jelle. Finally, on February 11th, Jelle got back to me, telling me he was indeed looking to hire a dedicated graphics worker for Marble League 2021. The next day, on February 12th, we sorted out all of the details of the agreement, and I ended up getting exactly what I asked for. I was now officially going to be working for Jelle's Marble runs as a graphics producer for the Marble League 2021 series. Now that I had a verbal agreement with the channel, it was time to start creating the templates for all the different graphics assets that would be needed for Marble League 2021. Jelle and I created a document where we discussed ideas for the graphics and worked through iterations of them as they went through the initial design stages. This might not be obvious to most viewers, but if you really look, there are a lot of different kinds of graphics used in the videos, and each one needs to have its own template to fill with information that comes from the event results or the video itself. Fortunately for me, Tom was kind enough to compile a sort of guide for Marble League graphics, where he went through each of the different kinds of graphics I need to make, what each was used for, and some important details to keep in mind when making my own versions of them. Whereas Tom used programming and spreadsheets to automate much of his production, I opted to use Adobe Suite, which I was much more familiar with at the time. This required a lot more manual labor on my part, but it also gave me much more control over the finer details, which I really appreciated. I used Photoshop to create the pieces for each template, Illustrator for any vector graphics I needed to make, After Effects for all the animation, and Media Encoder to export my graphics into files Jelle could put into the videos. While I referenced Tom's document a lot to inspire the design of the graphics, one thing I would have to decide on my own was the theme. Since the past few Marble Leagues had graphics packages themed after the host team, I figured I could tie in the graphics to the 2021 host team, which was the Crazy Cat's Eyes, by giving the graphics a sandstone kind of look. The idea was to make all of them look something like sandstone tablets, with chiseled cells organizing all of the important information, Visually, I don't think this was a bad design choice. There were definitely some mixed opinions about it, but generally people seemed to think it was fine. Practically, though, these graphics were absolutely terrible to work with. This isn't something I really thought about at first, but using an image as a background ended up being super inconvenient, as I had to cut out every shape I needed to make each graphic from the image, rather than just drawing them out using vector software. In hindsight, I definitely wish I had taken a different approach, especially since everything else about Marble League 2021 ended up being overwhelmingly sand themed, although I didn't really know that at the time I was creating the templates. While the sand background might not have been the best choice, there were definitely a lot of things I did with the graphics that I was really happy with. I'm a big fan of what I like to call compartmentalization, which is giving each piece of data its own cell in a graphic. I think it makes them easier to read and is also more visually appealing. If you compare my graphics to, say, the graphics from Marble League 2020, you can see how I opted to split the rows with fainter borders. So it's clear where each row is separated, but the data also feels like it's neatly split into columns. I generally tried to avoid rounded edges and circular shapes whenever possible, as I felt like those shapes really didn't fit the sandstone theme. While that was limiting for the design stage, I do think it was beneficial having neat rectangles to work with for the animation phase. One more thing I really tried to focus on in my design was readability. As someone who is visually impaired and who has watched videos on very small screens, I can appreciate things being readable at a small scale. I had this concept called the 50% rule, where anything I made had to be readable for me when I viewed it at a 50% scale on my monitor. I think fundamentally, the most important function of graphics is to provide the viewer with information they need in a way that's easily readable, and I think my work succeeded in accomplishing that. But of course, what really takes graphics to the next level is animation. I wanted to make a push towards having the graphics update in real time as the events played out, rather than just appear on the screen at the end of each competition. Ultimately, I was limited in what I was able to animate, mainly due to time constraints and my inability to quickly upload large files at the time. The two kinds of graphics I really went all out on designing for animation were the event standings and overall standings. The event standings, with the bar emerging from a cat's eye marble and revealing the results, that was actually Jelle's idea that I was able to bring to life. I was the one who came up with the idea for the overall standings table, with the points being added and positions actually moving up and down the table, and that was definitely my favorite type of graphic I produced for the series. It was actually an idea I originally got from Mario Kart games, where they add the points and update the leaderboards after each race. I thought it would look really cool in the Marble League videos, and then I had the ability to make it happen myself. As you might expect, this graphic is extremely complicated. I ended up being rather limited in what I was able to automate, largely because of the methods I was using. Once I got the technique down, I think it took me about an hour to produce each update to the overall standings table, but with how incredible they looked, I think it was worth the time. As we entered the pre-production phase of ML21, I had the theme and all the important templates designed and revised to the versions that would be included in the video. At this point, I was feeling really optimistic about me being in the graphics role. I really enjoyed the creative process behind designing the graphics. Jelle appeared pleased with what I was showing him, and the JMRC was there to provide me additional feedback whenever I needed it. Previously, the committee had helped a lot with the person designing graphics to gather all the data they would need to display, and I knew that I was going to have to rely on their help a lot for this upcoming Marble League. At the time, getting the opportunity to work with the committee was one of the most appealing aspects of the graphics job. I had already been a part of it and working with the other members for several months, and in that time, I really got to see just how much they did behind the scenes to make everything happen. When I was learning my graphics job, I couldn't have imagined what it would be like to take on the endeavor without their help. Little did I know at the time, that ended up being something I didn't have to imagine. Things were about to take a very sudden and very sharp turn for the worse. As I was settling into my new role and developing the ML21 graphics package, there was some tension starting to build between the JMRC, which I was still a part of after becoming employed by the channel, and Dion, Jelle's brother and co-owner of JMR. Based on what we know now, there was probably always a bit of friction between Dion and the committee since its inception back in 2019, But for a while, this never amounted to anything too consequential. Occasionally, you might see something like Dion going rogue on JMR social media and making a problematic post or comment using channel accounts, and then the committee would have to intervene and get it taken down to protect the channel's image. Generally, Dion's behavior was only problematic when he acted on his own impulses without consulting with other people beforehand. Because Dion's role with JMR was somewhat limited for a while, the extent to which his more reckless behaviors could hurt the channel was limited. But towards the end of 2020 and the start of 2021, there was a clear shift in Dion wanting to play a bigger role in the channel, and he started to challenge the authority of the committee and even Jelle himself. That's when things started to fall apart internally. This progression of Dion's increasing power over JMR's operations really came to a head in March of 2021, where there were two significant events that happened almost simultaneously, and really demonstrated how unwilling he could be to work with other people if he didn't want to. The first was a Twitter post in which he essentially gave a Marbula 1 team the identity of being ritualistic drug users. Problematic for obvious reasons. As it had done in the past, the committee brought this up with the channel's staff, but this time Dion took to defending the post, claiming it was justified because, and I quote, "A lot of smokers from all over the world spoke about their adoration for the hazers." What? While this post was eventually taken down, Dion's attempt at defending it definitely gave the committee members a feeling of disdain. Then, a few days later, Dion essentially gave himself the authority to veto a new Marble League team concept that Jelle and the committee had already agreed to add to the series in 2021. While he might have had some valid concerns about the new team's identity and adding it to the series, what really stuck out to us in the committee was his unwillingness to even try to discuss these concerns at all. He had already decided he didn't like the new team, and he was going to make sure it wasn't added. After this happened, everyone in the committee came together and started asking ourselves, what's the point of being community representatives to the channel if we feel like our input isn't being heard at all? Although the committee had gone through a lot of evolution over its 2 years, fundamentally its core purpose was to serve as a board of advisors to help the channel make decisions that would keep the community engaged and expanding. Now that Dion felt emboldened to contest our advice at his own will, and Jelle seemed unwilling to challenge Dion's ability to do that, we were seriously concerned about what role, if any, we would be able to play in shaping the future direction of the channel. After a few days of discussion, the community collectively went on strike, refusing to do anything to help the channel produce videos for a period of a few weeks. If nothing was done to keep Dion from mistreating the committee and its work, the committee would be dissolved, leaving the channel to figure out how to make up all the work that would be lost from such an outcome. During the time all of this was happening, I felt incredibly conflicted about what was happening. On one hand, I was absolutely in agreement with the committee's view that Dion was impairing their ability to function, and that change had to be made internally to prevent things from degrading even further. I was fully supportive of their decision to go on strike and their demands to return to continue working with the channel. On the other hand, even if the committee was about to disband, I sure wasn't going to be leaving along with them. I had already agreed to work for the channel during summer of 2021, and in spite of what was going on, I still wanted that job. But the very real prospect of losing the committee would definitely have a huge negative impact on my work. Not only was a lot of their work instrumental in gathering the data needed to produce the graphics at all, but they were also much more ideologically aligned with my view of how the channel should intend to operate. If all these people walked away, I would basically be losing my main support group for Marble League 2021, and I definitely did not want that to happen. But unfortunately, the conclusion was inevitable. Nothing was going to change, and Dion was going to continue holding the freedom to override the committee's input, and perhaps even Jelle's input on any decision he wanted to. On April 11th, the committee held a vote on what course of action to take, and the result was unanimous in favor of immediate dissolution. I chose to abstain from this vote since I had a clear conflict of interest in what I really wanted them to do, and I wanted to give them full control over their decision of whether to stay or leave. I had long committed to staying, and as much as I wanted to try to convince them to stick around for at least through ML21, I knew deep down that the right thing for them to do was to leave at that moment, and I should allow that to happen. The following day, on April 12th, the Jelle's Marble Runs Committee was officially dissolved. At the same time, Anton, the head of the committee, and a JMR staff member himself, who had been handling a lot of the channel's responsibilities, submitted his own resignation to the channel. It's hard to overstate just how impactful the dissolution of the committee was to everyone working for JMR at the time, myself included. There was suddenly a lot of uncertainty about the channel going forward. Who was going to make up the work that the committee had previously handled, like gathering data from video footage to determine event results, offer input on how to best run the channel's series, and handle the many more crises the channel was inevitably going to get itself into. Dion was sure that a new committee could be formed to fill in these gaps, but I wasn't convinced this was such a good idea. Sure, you could probably find enough people willing and able to help with the channel's internal functions, but how could you be sure of, 1, the accuracy and quality of their work, and 2, whether the intentions of these people were always good or not? The JMRC was purposefully very selective of who it invited to ensure there wouldn't be any of these kinds of issues, but now the channel was essentially going to entrust anyone who wanted to be involved, without making sure they would be a good fit for that role. Simply put, the most qualified people to serve in an advisory role like that were all people who were in the JMRC. That's why they were there in the first place. This dissolution should have served as a warning to the channel that this model likely wouldn't work with the direction the channel was heading, but they seemed committed to sticking to it. As all of this was happening, Jelle had been communicating privately with me about everything that was going on with the committee and his thoughts about it. One thing was clear. Jelle knew just as well as I did about how detrimental the loss of the committee would be to future series on the channel. He understood things wouldn't be as simple as forming a new committee and moving on, but he also expressed to me how he felt almost powerless about what was happening. That Dion was taking more and more control of the channel, and Jelle felt like he didn't have any way of stopping this from happening. Through these conversations, I understood that my role working for JMR was going to end up far different from how I imagined it. I wasn't just going to be producing graphics. I was going to have to help Jelle figure out how to pick up all of the broken pieces left from the committee's dissolution to ensure Marble League 2021 could still be a successful series. With all of this JMRC stuff going on during March and April, I was trying to keep myself out of the conflict as much as I reasonably could, since I knew I was going to be sticking with the channel, and it'd be ideal to remain on at least decent terms with everyone involved for the production of ML21, including Dion. I knew that if I became too vocal against what Dion was doing, there was the possibility of him trying to drive me out of the channel, something I definitely didn't want to happen at this point. As a result, in spite of what had just happened, I think I had mostly kept myself out of conflict with Dion, and for a while, things continued on that way. However, I suppose I should have known that such a conflict was inevitable, with myself being one of the only people still involved with the channel who was willing to speak out against him. On May 14th, things would finally boil over. And all over a freaking video thumbnail. To set the stage for this altercation, the video being released, the Marble League 2021 practice race, was the first video that was going to be released on the channel with me being the lead graphics producer. I had been working on graphics for about 3 months by this time, so the release of this video meant a lot to me, and that might have influenced what happened after that video was released. I had school that day, so I was periodically checking in with the community whenever I could to gauge the reactions to it. After the video had been out for a bit, I noticed a lot of people expressing their disapproval of the video's thumbnail, which had been changed from this to this. I think most people would look at these two designs and agree the newer version was worse. Still wanting to serve as a community representative and help the channel with its promotion, I brought this issue up in the JMR Facebook chat, expressing my concern over the new thumbnail. The conversation that followed from this, well, maybe I should just read through all of it. All right, so here's my initial post. Why is this the thumbnail for the video? I don't mean to offend anyone, but this doesn't look good at all. The pyramids are sloppily drawn, and they contrast heavily to the professional-looking ML21 logo. The text at the top also looks childish. Okay, so I'm guessing the rest of this message reads out something like, we're getting a lot of complaints from the community about the new thumbnail and should consider changing it back to the old one. Unfortunately, I didn't expand the rest of that message to document it. Okay, so this obviously was a bit harsh in tone, more so than I would have liked. Again, there were circumstances with this video that made me more impassioned than I should have been, but we were truly receiving a lot of complaints about it, so I wanted to make it clear that this was something that needed to be promptly addressed. Minos, JMR's composer who was becoming more involved with the channel's operations, agreed with my comment, and Jelle responded saying that Dion had designed this new thumbnail because he thought the original one was not good enough. And there's some discussion between myself, Jelle, and Minos about making a new thumbnail for the video. I'll skip down to Dion's response because that's where things really start to heat up. So Dion's first comment in this thread is, I'm celebrating my birthday. I don't understand why the thumb was not made before upload. Now it's problems again. So he's really not acknowledging the concern at all. He's just saying, it's my birthday and I don't want to deal with this. I don't think that's a good response, so I reply saying, Dion, I do wish you a happy birthday, but that's not a good explanation for your actions. The old thumbnail did not receive any complaints at all. I thought it was pretty basic, but not necessarily bad. The one you created was responsible for all of the negative comments, and although I can see some effort was put into it, it looks worse. At this point, I'm still trying to be as nice as I can about the situation while still emphasizing my original point. If Dion was so intent on celebrating his birthday without worrying about something like this, then I'm not entirely sure what motivated him to update the thumbnail to begin with. But anyways, this continues. Dion then says, I delete my Reddit, done with that negative shit. Minos steps in, saying, Dion, to be blunt, this does not solve any problems. Well said, Minos. I couldn't have said it better myself. Consulting a pro is one. I am not a pro on thumbnails, don't get me wrong, but use your team. This is what I talk about. Dion responds to him, saying, I am not worried about the thumbs, but there has to be a house style before upload. I'm just done with this shit, and even thinking about stopping with making videos. Why should we even invest so much when people are so negative? Making marble runs is maybe better. No salty complaining people anymore. We make these videos for the world, for entertainment, not to get shit over and over again. Minos replies again, saying, Dion, what do you mean? People are not negative, dude. They are expressive. You can't do all things right by yourself. That is why you must consult others, hire others, invest, yes. Because you get an income from their work. When people make positive comments, it's nice. But when they make negative ones, we must listen to them to get better, not running away from critics. When I started making music for the channel, I got negative comments as well. What did I do? Listen to those carefully, and this made me better for the audience I had. Again, excellent response from Minos here. This idea of effectively responding to criticism is something I'll expand more upon at the end of the video, but it's pretty clear Minos has a pretty good understanding of this and why it's so important. Anyways, this I think is where I'm finally able to catch up with the conversation since my initial post, and I give this response to Dion's concern about the negativity generated by the thumbnail. Dion, the negativity isn't directed at the channel. It's not directed at Jelle. It's directed at you and you alone. The fans absolutely love JMR content and the entertainment it brings. Jelle and the channel would be perfectly fine, except you have been acting in impulsive, irrational, and disrespectful ways to everyone else who worked so hard to create the content. Your actions then cause Jelle to be highly stressed and the quality of the content to drop. The problem lies not within the channel, but within you. If you want to leave JMR, go right ahead. At this point, it's probably one of the best things you can do for the channel. Out of all the things I said in JMR's internal discussions, this is definitely the one I regret the most. Don't get me wrong, I was very upset with the way Dion was handling the situation, but I should have known this kind of response was going to help nothing and only escalate the conversation. As I had been witnessing everything happening internally with JMR over the last few months, there was this resentment towards Dion and his actions building up in me. And I think this is really the moment where I finally just lashed out and made it clear how strongly I disapproved of the way he was handling all things related to the channel, not just the thumbnail. And again, Jelle had been continuously expressing his concern about Dion's actions to me in direct messages, which only made me more emboldened to speak out against him. But again, I came off way worse here than I probably should have, and I do apologize for that. Especially that part at the end about Dion leaving JMR. I think in the moment, a part of me was hoping Dion was seriously entertaining that idea, and given what had been happening with the channel recently, I really wanted to encourage that. But I should have known better than to expect Dion would actually just walk away from the channel. So then Dion responds to that comment saying, "Caden, better stay respectful, you are talking on behalf, but don't know the facts. You know nothing and I don't like your disrespectful tone. Understand that ML and M1 is founded by me, and if I want to stop the series, I will. I don't want to hurt my brother, but if people are talking about things that are basically not true and keep doing that, I will stop. And that means M1 and ML will come to an end. I don't want to live in negativity because others believe in lies from some salty ex-members. The way they destroyed a lighthearted and positive movement is heartbreaking." So now Dion's threatening everyone else. I can't speak to whether his claim about founding the Marble League in Marbula 1 is true to any extent. That's not something I can really prove or disprove, but I do know I had never seen him claim this prior to this conversation. That's another common theme with Dion. He basically invents these claims out of thin air whenever he wants to. Minos then steps into the conversation again, saying, "Dion, do chill, what the hell is with all this impulsiveness? What about you being disrespectful, ignoring your team? Be mindful of your actions to people who help you. Don't act like a child." And then Dion is responding to a few different people here. I'm talking about some people from Reddit and Discord who are infected by others. I would assume here he's referring to the former JMRC members who are probably saying very true things about Dion and his behavior at this point. Then he responds to Minos saying, "People are demanding and assaulting, and it's not fair, and it must stop now. Enough." It's not against the team, to be clear. Your advice is in most cases respectful, but to be judgmental like Caden is wrong. So Dion's pretty pissed off with me at this point, and understandably so. Yes, I was being judgmental to some extent, but I was forming these judgments off of things I had seen and witnessed over the past few months. I wasn't making claims out of thin air. The reality was, it was really hard to be anything but judgmental at this point, because I had already tried a more respectful approach, and he was just not open to hearing it. Okay, then I respond to Dion again, saying, "You have hurt your brother. I've seen it in several messages he has sent to me. He's stressed, concerned, and scared of what to do. You're also constantly overriding his plans and desire for running the channel. If you can prove the things you are saying, then people will believe you and respect you, yet you never prove anything you say. Jelle has proven his concerns to me many times, but he doesn't even need to, because I can see that he is telling the truth by what happens to the channel. If you really don't want to create marble races anymore, I understand that, but if you also want to take down your brother's dreams by trying to cancel production of his content, then I really do have no respect for you." I've already talked about most of this by now, but there's just one more thing I want to elaborate on here. It's hard to really convey just how bad Dion is at giving any substance to almost all of the arguments he makes in these discussions. If you're trying to convince someone that you know better than them, or know better than someone else, you have to give them a reason to believe that you have a better understanding of the subject and a better line of reasoning, that you really know what you're talking about. If you can't support the claims you're making, then you can't just expect people to take you at your word, especially if there's evidence to the contrary of what you're trying to claim. I think what's most telling about Dion's claims in this conversation is that no one is buying them. I'm not, Minos is not, Jelle is not. We all know this community criticism is coming from a well-meaning place, and as a result of people being concerned about the state of the channel, which they have every right to be at this point. But Dion doesn't want to have any of it, even when he's the one responsible for most of that criticism in the first place. Then Minos adds one last comment to this thread. I won't read it out here, but you can pause and read it if you want. Again, very well written, very well spoken. Then here's the last comment in this thread from Dion, and it sure is a doozy. Caden, this is one of the problems. Jelle has a form of autism and is complex. No one except my parents understand anything about his incapabilities. He is not always telling the truth, and sometimes he is incapable to deal with triggers and makes up scenarios. It's one of the problems we must deal with as a family. This is Jelle and his autism. I'm working 7 days a week and do everything for him on our channel. How can you just claim that everything he says is the truth? It's not, and I often talk with my brother about this. Okay, so I'll stop reading here because this message continues into some more personal details that I don't think need to be shared here. Dion has now made the conversation about Jelle's autism and some of the challenges that Jelle faces because of that. Let me be clear about this. Dion is absolutely right that autism can give people difficulty in understanding certain situations and handling stressful matters. I would know. I myself am autistic. And if Dion is looking to help his brother navigate through these tough situations and help him better understand what's really going on, then that's great. That's exactly what I hope he would do. The problem is, that is clearly not what is going on here. Dion is instead using his brother's autism as a means to justify his actions and to suggest Jelle's word cannot be trusted. For transparency's sake, I don't know the specifics of Jelle's autism diagnosis, and it's very possible that Dion understands those details better than anyone. But the simple fact is, that's just not relevant to what's happening with the channel right now. Jelle's autism and the effects it has on him has nothing to do with the fact that Dion is behaving recklessly in ways that pose a serious threat to the channel. That's something that is obvious to anyone who looks at these events, whether you have autism or not. And while I certainly don't always take Jelle at his word, I do consider him to be more trustworthy than his brother, especially because a lot of the things he says to me do have substance to back them up. I can take what he says, look at the things other people are saying, as well as using my own eyes to examine relevant context and information, and say, yeah, that sounds reasonable, taking into consideration everything else I already know. I can't do that with most of the things Dion says, and the fact that he feels he needs to use his brother's mental health condition as justifications for his actions is just terrible. Perhaps that's not what he intended with this message, but I really can't read it any other way. And to drive home the point I was making earlier, look at this last sentence of this message. A decision by JMR is never made by one man. This entire conversation started because Dion, and Dion alone, thought it would be a good idea to use this as a video thumbnail. It's just so hard to take anything this guy says seriously when he lost ideals like this that are so obviously not being met in reality. At this point, the conversation has strayed far from its original topic, and it's clear to me I am not going to have the last word, so I let it drop here. This conversation was extremely damaging to me and the working relationship I had with Dion. For me, it reinforced all of the negative notions I held about Dion and the harm his behavior was doing to the channel, and his unwillingness to respond to criticism in any meaningful way. For Dion, he definitely did not like me at all going forward, and he would essentially do everything in his power to avoid having to work directly with me ever again. This would lead to some more challenges as the release date for Marble League 2021 started to approach. That long discussion thread I just dove through sucked a lot of the optimism out of me heading into ML21, and things didn't seem like they were going to improve at all. The channel was still hell-bent on forming a new JMRC in spite of what had recently happened with the former one. Given I was a part of that old group and had already recognized a bunch of concerns with the way they were going about starting this new one, this wasn't exactly an effort I wanted to contribute to. I ended up leaving this new JMRC group in late May, just before it rebranded to the Jelle's Marble Association, or JMA. I essentially did this out of protest, as a way of expressing my disapproval of what the channel was doing. Besides, there was no reason for me to believe the people in this group were going to help my work in any way, even if I wanted them to. This was another decision I made that was probably ill-advised, given there was no stopping this transition to the JMA, and some of the people who did join would end up being instrumental to my work. For the meantime, I was just extremely frustrated with what I had been seeing over the past couple months, and this was part of my way of expressing that. Ultimately, I decided it would be good for me to return to the JMA, simply for the sake of being able to communicate with the people who would be helping with the series. While Jelle encouraged this idea and everyone else involved was on board, Dion stepped in and made sure I was never allowed to return to the JMA. This was more disheartening than anything. It was another example of Dion coercing everyone else involved with the channel to give himself exactly what he wanted. I figured at this point the best thing I could do was reach out to him directly and see if we could salvage our relations. I apologize for the aggressive tone of some of my comments and emphasize that, in spite of our differences, we were still working towards the same goal to make ML21 as successful as possible. Dion's response was pretty clear. He was not interested in trying to make amends. He had already decided he didn't like me, and nothing was going to change that. Not only was being locked out of the JMA detrimental for communication, but it also blocked my access to the place where different cuts of each video would be uploaded for people to review and find any mistakes that could be corrected before the video was published. As a result, I was under the impression that there was no way for me to review my work once I uploaded the graphics files to the drive where the editor would download them from to insert them into the video. There are so many details you have to get right when making graphics for a series like this, it's basically inevitable you'll screw up something somewhere, and that was one of the main purposes of video checking. But since I didn't have access to the JMA group, and I wasn't aware of any JMA members who were actively doing video checking themselves, all I could do was be extra careful that I got things right the first time before I uploaded them at all. Some of the more obvious graphic mistakes could be caught by the editor himself, but for smaller details, these often went completely missed if I didn't catch them myself. After I mislabeled one of the individual marbles in an early ML21 video, Jelle told me I needed to be more careful with these details in the future. I responded, taking responsibility for the mistake, but also emphasizing that my ability to even find mistakes with my work was limited because of the situation with the JMA and Dion. Still, nothing could be done to try to resolve this, although I was soon made aware of an alternative location to review video cuts and check for mistakes, which did help a lot. This was one of the many difficulties I encountered, all because Dion didn't like me and had total authority to lock me out of the JMA group. The last thing I'll discuss about Dion's attitude toward me here is this post he made about me in the JMA group after I had been removed. This was shown to me by one of the JMA members who ended up helping me with my work once ML21 began. Jelle, 2020 was the year with John Oliver. It's not objective to take that as a measuring point. I'm assuming that's like in relation to Jelle talking about how successful the channel was during that time. Also, Caden left the JMRC by himself and was complaining about a lot of things. Now he still does, but he is no member of the JMA. For this reason, I personally don't want to work with him. He is very talented, but his attitude brings chaos and despair. He is not constructive, and this JMA group now is. Caden has specific tasks and must stick with them. Again, some of the stuff he is saying here is true. I did leave the JMRC, now the JMA, on my own accord, and I was expressing discontent with a lot of things the channel was doing. But the conclusion he draws from this is that I'm this completely unbearable person to work with who has to have their presence in the channel's operations limited to protect this vision Dion has for the channel's operations. He even uses the word personally in his response. He realizes that I'm a valuable asset to the channel and producing some quality work, but because of his personal disagreements with me, I deserve to be shut out of this very valuable resource for my work, even though I'm still working effectively with every other person actively involved with the channel at this point. It's really worth emphasizing here that I never had any substantial difficulty working with anyone else at JMR. including Jelle, or Minos, or Cars the video editor, or anyone in the JMA. All of these people worked with me, expressed their appreciation for what I was bringing to the channel, and never attacked the concerns I had for the channel. In fact, most of the time, these people agreed with my concerns. I just find it really difficult to believe that I am the one responsible for causing all of these problems, when I'm still on good terms with every other person at JMR. But of course, Dion's word trumps the word of everyone else when it comes to most of the organizational decisions being made here. That last sentence about me having specific tasks and needing to stick to them is especially ironic. I had specific tasks for producing the graphics, sure, but my responsibilities for helping the production of ML21 extended far beyond that kind of work. In spite of all the chaos and despair I supposedly brought into JMR's working environment, it is undeniable that a lot of what I did ended up protecting the channel from sinking further into chaos despair than it already had because of everything that had happened in recent months. So now I think is a good time to transition into the full extent of all the work I did to ensure ML21 could be the best series I could help produce. I'm not really sure I've ever delved into the full extent of everything I did for JMR during ML21, mostly because I didn't think it was all important to acknowledge, and I didn't want people to think I was trying to extract praise for all the work I was doing. However, I think for the sake of this video, it is worth going through everything, just so there can be a public account of it all. Throughout JMR's history, there's been a trend of certain individuals who work closely with the channel getting themselves involved in far more things than they originally bargained for. JMR has never really been great at attending to all the tasks required to effectively run a business like the one they have, so it usually falls on the shoulders of someone else to handle all the details being overlooked by the channel owners. I think I was definitely that person for the channel during this time. If something crucial was being overlooked or neglected, I was the one who would identify it and try to address it the best that I could. I'll start with the more obvious stuff, the job I was originally hired for: graphics production. I already touched on this work earlier in the video, but I can certainly expand on it a bit here. For every Marble League 2021 video, I was the one making all of the motion graphics that appeared on screen to communicate information, show who was competing, and display the results and overall standings. In total, I produced graphics for all 16 main Marble League event videos, the 8-event Marble League Showdown 2021 series, the 4-event ML21 qualifiers video, the aforementioned 2021 practice race video, and the Marble League 2021 qualifiers draw video. Now, if you never heard of that last video, that's because it was never actually released. The draw happened, but they never made a video out of it. I still made graphics for it though. Oh yeah, speaking of the ML21 draw, since that video wasn't ever released, one idea I had to engage community support in the days leading up to the qualifiers video was to reveal one team in each of the groups every day, slowly building up to the full group revealed right before the qualifiers. I floated this idea by Jelle and a couple other people who thought it sounded like a great idea. For the first couple days, I made posts for the group reveals, and these posts were doing exceptionally well at generating hype for the qualifiers. I mean, each of the Reddit posts was getting hundreds of upvotes. This was a wildly successful project, and one I was determined to see through to its finish. Then, a few days into it, I received word that the full groups had been effectively leaked by a video posted to JMR socials, and wouldn't you know it, Dion made that post. Now, it's not remotely fair for me to shame someone for making a simple mistake like this, but when you consider how influential Dion was in avoiding safeguards proposed by the former JMRC to make sure problematic posts like leaks would never happen, I think it's fair to say he is absolutely at fault for this. It's almost like those JMRC people knew what they were talking about. This was one of the many things that just made me feel even more demotivated to handle the workload in front of me. It felt like a lot of the time I would try to help the channel out, those efforts would be ruined if they weren't shut down outright. Anyways, tangent over. As I mentioned earlier, I had a reference document from Tom, the previous JMR graphics contractor, to use as a base guide for the graphics I made. This guide was not only helpful for designing templates, but also how to effectively display information using them. The fundamental purpose of graphics in sports-like videos is to communicate relevant information about the sporting event to anyone who's watching. Therefore, I had to think about what graphics were needed to begin with, what information I should include on each graphic, and how I should organize that information on the graphic. Because each event is different and the types of results those events produce can vary wildly, I ended up having to make a lot of variations of each template to neatly fit all the different sets of information I needed. Then, after I produced all the event-specific graphics, I would create the updated overall standings graphic, which is one of the only templates that stayed constant throughout the videos, although I would occasionally make adjustments to that one as well. I think my biggest realization from doing this kind of work is just how much work actually has to be done in the first place. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of graphics in every Marble League video, but you probably wouldn't think much of them if you didn't try to pick all of them out specifically. Just as an example, here's my folder where I kept the files for just one of the Marble League event videos. This one was for the 5-meter sprint, one of the simplest events featured in that year's ML, and there's still a ton of files that all had to be made for the video. Anything that is listed as a PNG or MOV ended up being included somewhere in the final video. Some of these PNG files were used as building blocks for the more complicated animated graphics, like the event standings or overall standings update, which are the MOV files in this folder. Generally, a simple event like this one required around 4 to 6 hours of work to produce all the graphics for. There were a few videos that ended up taking much more time than that. The qualifiers video was one, although that was essentially 4 events in a single video. I'll talk about the event that involved by far the most amount of work towards the end of this video. Now, before you can even make the graphics, you have to know what information to include on them in the first place. Specifically, I'm talking about event results, all of which have to be manually recorded by watching the video footage and determining what times or scores should be given to each team's performance. Jelle ended up relying on me a lot for this, often just shooting the footage, uploading it to a folder, and leaving me to determine the exact results. We had an internal spreadsheet where all these results were recorded and stored so they could be referenced by me to produce the graphics and anyone else who needed to use them. To be clear, I didn't have any issue with performing this task myself, but it did definitely add more time to my job and made it a lot higher pressure. The reality is, when you're trying to calculate the exact raw data to record in a spreadsheet to perfectly represent what happens in the video, you're probably going to make a mistake at some point. There's some foreshadowing for you. While I was able to do this myself for most of the videos, there were some events where I wanted to create more complex graphics that updated in real time as the event played out. The problem was, these types of graphics required way more data than I was capable of collecting myself. This was the kind of thing I would have relied on the old JMRC to help me with, since I knew a lot of them had been willing to assist in this kind of work and were very good at it. But of course, that group didn't exist anymore, so I had to figure something else out. I ended up being able to reach out to a few members in the JMA and talk them into helping me with data collection. It was completely on me to essentially initiate these individuals on how to record live data for raw video footage, a topic that is way more difficult than it sounds and is usually only feasible with the assistance of video editing software. Because I was still locked out of the JMA, I was also responsible for forming the communication between myself and these JMA members. The bottom line is, this was an entire extra thing I created and managed just so that I could make my other work better. And while I definitely led this initiative, I have to give shoutouts to the 3 JMA members who were willing to help me. As far as I'm aware, these people were not given any special credit anywhere for their exceptional contributions for ML21, nor were they given any financial compensation for their time doing them. So, to Dylan, Dante, and Phoenix, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your willingness and eagerness to work with me during Marble League 2021. Suffice to say, a lot of my proudest graphics work for this series would not have been possible without your help. I also ended up playing a pretty major role in event design, which I was delighted to see I was credited for in the closing ceremony, even though I didn't ask to be. Specifically, the event's elimination race and football were largely influenced by my concepts for them. Elimination race was originally an event from 2019 that was mostly forgotten, but I thought there was a lot of potential for bringing back the event concept if it was executed better. My vision for elimination race was originally something much more akin to a pyramid-themed labyrinth that all 16 marbles could run through, with the last marble to escape being eliminated. Well, that's not exactly what the event ended up looking like. It was hard for me to be disappointed with the end result, especially with how well received it was by the community. Football, on the other hand, ended up matching up with my original concept for the event pretty much perfectly. I created the design of the football pitch, found the plastic footballs Yells could order to use in the event, and came up with the idea for 2 half matches with extra time to break ties as needed, as well as the full bracket format with seeding based on events prior to the start of the event. In other words, this event was essentially mine, and I was really happy with how it turned out, as were many people in the community. By the way, JMR, I'd imagine you still have that football pitch stored somewhere. It'd be really cool to see it dusted off and used for another video someday. The last major role I played during ML21 was essentially serving as an advisor to Jelle. Whenever he needed feedback about something, whether it was how to run an event, how to handle a potential controversy, and whether there might have been unfair advantages for some teams over others, he would come to me and ask for my input, which I was more than happy to give. Of course, this is exactly what the old JMRC was for, and the fact that Jelle kept reaching out to me for advice instead of consulting with the JMA just reaffirmed my conviction that the JMA was not the effective JMRC replacement everyone wanted it to be, or at least that Jelle couldn't consider it to always be more reliable than myself. While I tried to fill this role the best I could, it was made pretty difficult by all of the stress both he and I were under at the time. And besides, I am unmistakably human, which meant there would inevitably be times I got it wrong. The unfortunate reality is that it's very difficult to make it through an entire 16-event marble competition series without some kind of significant controversy popping up. We were actually doing pretty good for a while, with nothing too major coming up during the entire first half of the series. However, when we got to event 9, the triathlon, there was an incident in the video that I knew was going to spark a lot of discussion, no matter how we ended up handling it. Here's how things went down internally. Jelle reached out to me, informing me of a potential disqualification ruling that could be assessed to one of the marbles competing in the triathlon for pushing another marble off the track. As was common during this time, he consulted with me for my input, so I reviewed the raw video footage of where the incident took place. In it, I saw exactly what Jelle was talking about. One marble, Blue Eye, had pushed another marble, Rojo Trace, off the sand portion of the course. There wasn't much doubt in my mind about how I thought it should be handled. Blue Eye clearly ended another marble's run prematurely by pushing them off the track. I recalled previous incidents where disqualification rulings were issued, and my interpretation of these was that any marble or team who egregiously impeded another team's ability to compete in the event would be disqualified. That's what I thought happened here, so my mind was made up. However, I thought it would be good to consult the JMA members I was working with at the time to get their input as well. After some discussion, they were both in agreement with my stance on the issue, so I reported back to Jelle, informing him our advice would be to follow through with the disqualification ruling. Thus, that's what ended up happening in the video. Now, I knew this was going to be controversial no matter how we ruled on it, but considering that I and everyone else I talked to was in agreement on the disqualification being just, and that Jelle had clearly thought the disqualification was at least a reasonable ruling, given him reaching out to me, and the fact that he had already recorded the footage of the alternate scenario where Blue Eye was disqualified, I thought viewers would generally be in agreement we made the right call. As it turns out, I was wrong. Very, very wrong. The comment section of the video and the video subreddit post were flooded with comments from people expressing their anger and disapproval of our decision to disqualify Blue Eye. This was pretty jarring for me to see, because again, I was under the impression that we made the right call up until this point. Part of me does wonder if we had ruled the other way, that Blue Eye shouldn't have been disqualified for the push, we would instead have gotten a bunch of angry comments from people upset that nothing was done to punish Blue Eye or give consolation to the Rojo Rollers. It's hard to know for sure. But what I do know is the backlash from how we decided to rule this vastly exceeded my expectations. As it turned out, we barely had the time to weather the storm from this controversy before another one popped up in the next event, this one of a much different variety than the one previous. In Event 10, Steeplechase, someone in the community noticed that a marble on the Savage Speeders had their time incorrectly recorded, meaning their result and position in the event standings were wrong. It didn't take long to verify this claim. That fan was absolutely right. This immediately sent me into a panic. First, because I was almost certainly the one who was responsible for incorrectly recording the result on the spreadsheet, and second, because I already knew how close the final standings of Marble League 2021 ended up being. I knew that even a single swap in event results could have massive implications on the final standings and be difficult, if not impossible, to correct. Keep in mind, the closing ceremony had already been filmed and the stadium had been torn down by this point. So, if there was no way to correct the error while keeping the final standings the same, we might have had to just live with it. I went scrambling to find a solution to this problem, and ultimately, I did find one. It was indeed possible to make sure the Savage Speeders and Gliding Glaciers still finished in the same final overall standings positions while correcting the erroneous result. Unfortunately, events 15 and 16 both relied on the standings going into those events to determine seeding or starting positions, and there wasn't any solution I could find to remedy those standings, again because of how close they were. So the solution I ended up proposing was that we leave the error for now, and then in the final event, make it look like the Savage Speeders reviewed their result, appeal to the officials about the mistake, and have it corrected there. That way, the standings after each event wouldn't have to be changed, but we could still fix it in the final standing. For how much this mistake could have disrupted the ML21 standings, we were really fortunate that it only affected one other team, and that we could find a solution that was maybe not ideal, but certainly adequate. Having two major incidents back to back like this definitely increased the stress I was already feeling working for ML21. Controversies are really difficult to deal with internally, especially because there's often a lot of conflicting opinions on how to handle them and make sure they don't happen again in the future. What these events really made me think about was how it really made me feel the loss of the JMRC. Of course, there's no way of knowing that group would have prevented these controversies from ever happening, but both incidents felt like they were allowed to happen largely because of the absence of a group like that set up to handle potential controversies before they reached the public. For the disqualification ruling, I can think back to at least one time during my days during the JMRC, before I started working for the channel, where we were discussing a potential new idea to add to one of our series, and I was the only dissenting voice among several people in the conversation, with everyone else seemingly in agreement that the idea was good. But I was able to share my concerns about the idea with the rest of the group, and in the end, I convinced them not to implement it. I bring that up here because if the JMRC was still around for ML21, it's possible someone could have looked at the Blue Eye incident differently and made us think more about the potential consequences of issuing that disqualification ruling, perhaps persuading us not to. Regardless, having so many voices to gather input from is pretty much always valuable when discussing how to handle potential controversies. Then for the other incident, that misrecorded result was something that could have been caught in one of the many stages of production before the video released, and having more eyes to watch the draft of the videos makes it more likely mistakes are noticed and can be fixed so they don't sneak into the final video. I don't know exactly how many people were reviewing videos as they were being produced, but I can't imagine there were many outside of myself and the JMA members who were working with me. These events really made me think about just how much better things could have been handled if the committee was still around. Both of these controversies could have been avoided if there were more people actively involved in the production process of the videos. At the very least, some of the committee members might have been able to help craft more elegant solutions for dealing with the incidents. These were definitely the times where I felt the loneliest in my role for JMR. During this period, I was often the only consistent link of communication between the channel and the community, and that made me feel greatly responsible for resolving community concerns whenever they came up. There wasn't really anyone else who chose to step up and help me when dealing with things like this. I was able to confide in the JMA members who were helping me, and some ex-JMRC members who were sympathetic to the things I was going through, but ultimately, it was left for me to figure out what to do. And I did. At least I did to the best of my ability, but that only made my job even more stressful. These events made me even more certain of the idea that my time working for JMR couldn't last for much longer. Realistically, I had already known for a while that my time working for JMR was probably not going to last after ML21 ended. While I really enjoyed making graphics and helping one of my favorite YouTube channels create videos, I knew that this endeavor was becoming much too stressful for me to continue on with it for much longer. Keep in mind that I was on summer break during the production of ML21, which meant I didn't have a large number of responsibilities outside of JMR during that time. Once school and school-related activities started back up, I knew I wouldn't have the time to continue working like this. Besides, I wasn't sure if the channel would want to continue working with me post ML21 anyways, even if I did want to. After the two controversies I just talked about happened, I essentially confirmed that the end of ML21 would be the end of my working for JMR, at least in my mind. Now that the end was in sight, I felt a renewed sense of motivation that really helped me produce some of my best work towards the end of the series. Every event from number 11 onwards to the end was a lot of work, each in its own way. For events like Sand Moguls and Sand Rally, myself and my JMA helpers would do position tracking for each of the races, and then I would use that information to create live position towers for all of the races. Diving required a lot of careful footage analysis to determine the scores each team received. I know there was a lot of criticism for this event being hard to watch, and believe me, it was just as difficult to determine where exactly most of the marbles landed on the targets in the first place to give out scores to them. For the elimination race, Jelle or one of the JMA members had already done the work to list the finishing positions of all teams after each round, so I figured I would incorporate all of those into a new kind of graphic that would update every time a marble crossed the finish line. Football was a very special event for me, not only because I was so influential in the event's design, but also because designing graphics for it really felt like a callback to the ice hockey graphics I designed in the Winter Special, the event that propelled me into the graphics role in the first place. I just really love the way the live scoreboards turned out, both for hockey and football. It's definitely one of my favorite kinds of graphics I ever produced for JMR, and probably one of the most helpful, too. However, we had saved the most challenging event for the very end. Marblecross was going to put all of our abilities to the test. This was the first time JMR had ever produced an M1 style race without the help of the JMRC, and the committee had played a very large role in the production of each of those videos. For me, the ultimate goal was to have a live position tower displaying all 16 teams and updating after every position change in the race, similar to what was done in Marbula 1 Season 2. But it was hard to say whether this goal was realistic at all, because the amount of work that goes into making a graphic like that is just crazy. So let's go through that entire process now. Also, keep in mind, we basically went through this entire process twice. Once for the main league's finale and once for the final event of Showdown, although the Showdown version was thankfully a bit less total work. To start, we needed to produce a list of every single position change at every single point in time across a 7-minute race. Already, this is a daunting task to take on. The JMRC had developed some really intricate spreadsheets to assist with this process for Marbula 1 races, and Tom was kind enough to show me how to use them, as well as helping me adapt the sheets for the Marble League versions of the races. But I wasn't going to be able to take this all on myself, so I then reached out for the help of my JMA friends, teaching them everything I had just learned myself so they could assist me with this process if they felt they had the time to. The amount of work they did here especially is so incredible, and this was also the point of the year where school-related responsibilities were starting to come back into my life, so here especially, I really can't thank them enough for their help. Finally, after hours and hours of collective manual work, there were just a few errors I needed to work out in the recorded position changes before I finally had what I needed. A full list of timestamps for every single update of the position tower. This was a major accomplishment in and of itself, but it was only the first step. Next, I had to go into After Effects and use the data we collected to fully animate the position tower. Just to give you an idea of how many animations that involved, here's a screenshot of the project timeline. Every diamond represents a keyframe for an animation. So yeah, there was a lot of animation that needed to be done here. Thankfully, I was able to automate some of it by finding an obscure forum post explaining the exact process I needed to copy the position update data into After Effects, but there was still a lot I had to do manually. I couldn't find any way to automate the time delta updates after each lap, so I had to individually update those values after every lap. Since the standings were so close going into this event, I thought it would be cool to show which teams were provisionally on the overall podium at all times during the race. I shared this idea with Tom, and he basically did all of that work for me, providing me a complete list of all the teams provisionally first, second, and third throughout every point in the race. If I hadn't said it already, Tom, I seriously cannot thank you enough for all your help during the series, and especially this last video. Once I had that data available to me, I just had to animate some gold, silver, and bronze text layers over top of the position tower. Finally, after cumulative dozens of hours of work, I had exactly what I wanted. A fully animated, live updating position tower for the entire race featuring all of the teams. This was a huge project to put together, and while my name will always be attached to it first and foremost, developing it was truly a team effort, and one I could never have done on my own. After that monster of a graphic was made, I still had some other things to design for that final video, especially the closing ceremony. Every Marble League ends with a full overall standings table for the entire tournament, so I quickly put that together, including the score correction from Steeplechase. Jelle told me he would really like some fireworks to set off during the closing ceremony and credits, so I ended up learning how to make fireworks in After Effects. It actually turned out to be pretty easy, and they were definitely a nice touch to the cinematics. Finally, there were the custom gold, silver, and bronze team logos that I created as part of the closing ceremony graphics. It's funny, the reason I ended up creating these graphics was that on the first day of high school, I was stuck in a room with a computer that had all the Adobe software installed on it, sitting on my desk. So I spent the time figuring out how to put the gradients together and add them to the raw logo files. I really liked how these turned out, so much so that I ended up creating them for every other Marble League year as well. And this collage of custom logos is definitely one of my favorite collections of graphics work I've ever done. All in all, this video was a ton of work, but it was definitely worth it, as it ended up becoming one of my absolute all-time favorite videos, and certainly my favorite I'd ever been a part of creating. In spite of all the challenges that led up to this point, I can say I finished my time working for the channel with some of my proudest work. Stuff that I'll always be able to look back on and feel accomplished with. After that video was released, all there was left for me to do was to make a few corrections to previous graphics for the All Events video that was released a few days later. With that, my work for Marble League 2021 was officially complete. Immediately following the release of the Marble League 2021 All Events video, I contacted Jelle for one final business discussion, and it was pretty clear there was a mutual understanding between us that my time working for his channel was over. For me, while I absolutely loved graphic design as a job and getting to work for one of my favorite YouTube channels, the endeavor had become something far more involved and more stressful than I had ever expected it to be. And as much as I wanted to believe I could continue working like this in the future, I knew that once my real life responsibilities came back into full force, I just wouldn't have the time I would need to be able to dedicate to help keep the channel running. From JMR's perspective, I think the channel was certainly moving in a direction where paying a separate contractor thousands of dollars per series just to produce graphics probably wasn't going to be remaining in their business model. Even if Jelle wanted to keep me around, I doubt he would have been able to provide me adequate compensation for my work. And keep in mind, I wasn't asking for very much to do all that work in the first place. I sent Jelle a letter of resignation, thanking him for the opportunity to work for the channel, and my last words of advice for how we should try to move the channel forward in spite of all the terrible things that had happened to it over 2021. I was fully aware that Jelle probably wouldn't have been able to act on my advice even if he wanted to, but I figured after all we'd been through, it was the best I could leave him with. Thus concluded my time being involved with JMR. Well, kind of. After months of JMR easing up on video production, they produced another edition of Marbula 1 and the Marble League in 2022. Prior to both of these series starting, I inquired to JMR about the prospect of me working for them again, essentially taking on the same role I had worked for Marble League 2021. Now, I know that I had just mentioned how untenable that work had become for me to continue with, so why was I trying to become involved again? Really, I think it just came down to how hard it was for me to walk away from it all. In spite of all the difficult things I dealt with over a relatively short period of time, I loved the work that I did, and I wanted to continue doing it. Keep in mind, I was still a high school senior about to go to college. The only other options I had for working at this point in my life was part-time at either a restaurant or a factory. Jobs that I couldn't really argue as being any better than working for JMR, even if I didn't have to deal with quite the same levels of organizational dysfunction. But anyways, although I did reach out, and Jelle did seem to express some level of interest in the idea, those talks never got very far. And in hindsight, I am glad they didn't, especially considering how the timing of those series ended up being vastly different than what I originally expected. I doubt I would have been able to produce my best work when school was in full force, even if I wanted to believe I could somehow make that happen. After all was said and done, I basically went back to who I was before, a member of the community who occasionally put together nice looking graphics to share with other fans of the channel. The hours I worked for JMR definitely did a lot to enhance my graphic design skills and ideas, and some of my finest graphics work I've ever done comes from the 2 years since I departed from the channel. I also had the opportunity to create the lore for a new Marble League team called the Wolfpack, which took direct inspiration from a new team concept I had come up with in the past. The channel was even kind enough to reach out to me and inquire about naming the manager of the team after me, which was a gesture I really appreciated. To this day, I am still somewhat involved with the community, occasionally talking about what's happened in the latest video or discussing the current state of affairs of the channel. With that being said, I think I'm definitely reaching the point in my life where marble sports is starting to be phased out of it. I'm now in year 2 of college, pursuing a degree of computer science, and I was even fortunate enough to be given an internship opportunity last summer, and I expect to be interning again this upcoming one, although I'm not sure exactly where yet. I found a lot of things to be involved with at college, met a lot of really great people, and overall, I'd say things are going pretty well for me now. I think I can safely say I probably wouldn't still be working for JMR anymore, even if things had gone the way I originally expected them to. As other more important things begin to take up more time in my life, the amount of it I can spend focused on marble races at all is rapidly decreasing. I think I'll probably continue to watch the videos as they are released, but if I ever cease activity in the community, that's why. As for JMR, the channel seems to have reached a point of relative stability once again, settling into a new, more consolidated structure. They are continuing to produce videos, try new concepts for series, and pursue new business opportunities. While this is all good, it is pretty clear the channel has become stuck in a stage of almost total stagnation, with channel growth being almost non-existent over the past few years, and videos struggling to go viral or reach the higher view counts they frequently experienced before and during the pandemic. Unfortunately, the channel has also continued to distance itself from the community, with relations between the two entities appearing to degrade over time. Realistically, this is what I and a lot of the ex-JMRC members anticipated would happen when JMR began to establish its post-COVID lockdown philosophy for running its channel. I think the main reason JMR hasn't grown a lot in the past few years is because they're just not set up to, and they seem content with that. At the very least, they seem to be in a position to keep producing videos for the foreseeable future, and that is good to see. But there are other things about the channel that still have me concerned now, and I'd like to end this video by expanding upon those concerns a bit more. When I look back at my time working for JMR, I have very conflicting feelings thinking about everything I did and experienced. There's no other way to put it. This was an incredible opportunity for me to have at the time that I was given it. I was a junior in high school with almost no graphic design experience outside of school, being put into the graphics producer role for a YouTube channel with over 1 million subscribers whose videos consistently get hundreds of thousands of views. This was almost like a dream job for me, getting to contribute to what was undoubtedly my favorite YouTube channel by doing work I found really enjoyable. Getting to design all the graphics was an amazing creative outlet for me, which is something I really valued at the time, especially compared to other jobs that I worked during that time in my life, where I was told exactly what to do and how to do it. Here, I was given a tremendous amount of freedom to do things my own way, to come up with my own ideas and figure out how to make them come to life. I will always be able to look back on all the graphics work I did and take a lot of pride in it. For my first series, I think I did a pretty good job at designing everything. I was especially happy with how all the animated graphics turned out, even if those involved a lot more work to produce. Jelle was also great to work with and bounce ideas off. I found we generally had similar enough visions for my work that there wasn't ever really any tension in our working relation. He was also really open to my ideas for other parts of the production, like event design and the overall structure of the series. In the end, I probably had a more influential role on Marble League 2021 than most people who have worked for JMR have ever had on a single series on the channel. And that's something I can be happy about, considering it's generally regarded as one of the better series the channel has ever produced. As much fun as the job itself was, I think the most valuable aspect of my time working with JMR was how it gave me a lot of professional development at a relatively young age. Especially in the JMRC days, I learned a lot about how to properly function in a working environment, how things are handled internally at a company, and how to interact with people both inside and outside of that inner circle. Being surrounded by a group of adults who conducted themselves professionally was immensely helpful in developing a more professional demeanor for myself, and I was always able to have honest conversations with those people if they needed to happen. A lot of the exposure I got to the working world post JMRC wasn't as great, but I think it was still valuable in some ways. I learned how damaging internal feuds can be to businesses when everyone isn't on the same page. I learned how to interact with people both above and below me in the working chain. And I definitely learned a thing or two about how saying the wrong thing can make those interactions go very wrong very fast. All in all, having this working experience at the age I did really helped give me a head start about how to work in the professional world. And the full extent that has benefited me and will continue to benefit me in my future endeavors is something I'll probably never be able to fully comprehend. But while I am happy with what I was able to accomplish in the short time I worked for the channel, I can't help but feel a sense of longing that Marble League 2021 would have only been the beginning and not also the end. As many things as I did well during that series, there were other things I wish I could have improved upon in future series. The foundations for my design were in place, and if I had the opportunity to refine my style and try out even more new ideas, I think I could have eventually really mastered that role and produced some truly incredible graphics for all of JMR series, better than anything the channel had seen before. I also had a lot of great ideas to push the design of Marbula 1 graphics forward, and I never even got the chance to work on a series like that. When I first talked to Jelle about taking on the graphics role, I was envisioning working with the channel for years to continue that job for the rest of high school and into college, really establishing JMR's video graphics production and presentation while getting to work alongside some of my best friends in the JMRC, and to be paid decently for all of my work. That was the future I was looking forward to when I accepted the job, and at the time, there wasn't really any reason for me to think things wouldn't work out that way. Obviously, I could have never expected the JMRC's dissolution, the fallout between me and Dion, and the overall lack of support I was given to complete all of the work I was asked to do. And while I still did all the work and enjoyed it for the most part, I couldn't help but feel that things should have been better. That the JMRC should have still been there to work alongside me. That Dion shouldn't have been able to upend my work so much because of my adversarial relationship with him. That I shouldn't have had to serve as the only reliable link between the channel and the community, and to feel the full burden of pressure whenever a controversy arose within the community. I can't help but think if things hadn't degraded internally so soon after I took the role, my time working for JMR would have been a lot less stressful and a lot more enjoyable. At times, this dream job honestly felt a lot more like a nightmare. And in the end, I couldn't help but be thankful when it was all finally over. But in spite of everything I had to deal with, I was ultimately one of the lucky ones. When all was said and done, I was walking away with a series that had my name and influence all over it, an entire portfolio of work and new skills I could add to my resume, and a considerable amount of financial compensation. There are many people I know who worked for JMR, either directly or through the committee, who poured just as much time and effort and love into their work for the channel as I did, only to walk away with far, far less. The way some of these people were treated by the channel was just awful to see and witness, especially considering the work they were doing for JMR, oftentimes with no compensation at all. People looking out for the channel's best interests, only to be told their voices didn't matter. People producing exceptional things to help the channel, only for the channel to move on from them in an instant. People trying to raise valid concerns with the channel's operation, only to be told they didn't understand how things really were. None of these people deserve to be treated with such disrespect, especially when considering how much some of their work drove the channel forward and contributed to its overall success. For some of them, their experience has completely ruined their ability to enjoy JMR content at all. And while that's not exactly a perspective I share, as I still watch most of the videos, it is one I can completely understand. What's so disappointing to see now, and this is a large part of the reason I wanted to get around to making this video, is that well-meaning people are still finding it extremely difficult to work with or interact with the channel. Even to this day, there are people continuing to publicly announce their decisions to walk away from JMR, citing difficulties working with the channel and the way it operates internally. Again, these are people who we know to be very reputable and positive contributors, so it's hard to believe that the channel isn't implicated in any of these people's frustrations. This cycle of people wanting to become involved with the channel, doing truly fantastic things for it, and then being left feeling like they have no choice but to quit, has been going on for years now. And most of the concerns these people cite as reasons for leaving are similar. Largely as a result of this continuing cycle, that relationship between the channel and the community has become severely damaged. Anyone in the community who identifies any of the very clear shortcomings with the way the channel is operating now is ignored and accused of spreading misinformation. They just aren't interested in hearing concerns from the community about the behaviors of the channel and the people working for it, and that's leading them to commit some very problematic actions. The copyright strikes issued to Saratobi-sama and Thesaurus Dinosaurus are great examples of the channel's complete ignorance to the harm it's doing to its reputation, and their commitment to silencing anyone else who dares speak out against them. Heck, I wouldn't be surprised if they try to get this video taken down, even though I tried to limit the criticism of the channel to the things that were directly impacting my work for them. I think JMR's fundamental problem, the thing that's holding themselves back more than anything else right now, is their inability to meaningfully consider any criticism laid against them. They seem to be stuck in this mindset that any criticism directed towards them is being done in bad faith, as an attempt to be excessively negative and attack the people running the channel, rather than earnest attempts to identify areas the channel can and should seek to improve. There have been a lot of people calling for the channel to change the way it operates and interacts with the community for a while now, and for very good reason. People are continuing to be hurt by some of the channel's decisions that are oftentimes reckless and seem to have no regard for the harm they could be causing to people. And as long as JMR doesn't listen to community concerns seriously, there's going to be a great amount of distrust between the two. And that's good for nobody. The community is going to feel like their perspective on things doesn't matter, and people in the community who normally would have jumped at the opportunity to help the channel and its production are going to be a lot more skeptical about wanting to become involved, and rightfully so. Many of the channel's most important contributors got their start as community members, including Anton, Tom, myself, and a whole bunch of other people who have worked for the channel throughout its history. Even Greg Woods only found out about JMR because someone shared one of their races in a subreddit. JMR stands to gain greatly from having their community involved in working alongside them and promoting them, but in order for that to happen, JMR is going to have to change. There's just no other way to put it. They're going to have to understand some of the more difficult things the community is trying to tell them and figure out how to organize their business in a way that doesn't leave people feeling hurt and frustrated. That's the only way things are going to change for the better. On that note, I'll close with this. Back in 2019, before anything I talked about in this video happened, I essentially got myself driven completely out of the JMR community. People were really annoyed with a lot of my behaviors at the time and didn't want to have me involved with the things they were working on. This was difficult for me to understand at the time because I just couldn't see all the issues people had with the way I was acting. My initial reaction was to think that the problem was not with me, but with the community, and that I should try to find a better community that would accept me for who I was. So I tried that, but I couldn't find one that filled the void left by the JMR community. Eventually, I started talking to some of the people from that community, and those people really helped me start to understand the criticisms people in the community had for me. That's when I started to realize I had a lot of room for improvement in the ways I interacted with other people. And when I rejoined the community at the beginning of 2020, I slowly adjusted the way I conducted myself there, and it certainly brought results. I ended up becoming a much more respected person and someone people truly liked working with. And that's why I ended up being invited to the JMRC in late 2020, in spite of what had happened in the past. If I hadn't listened to all the criticisms people had against me during my early days in the community and tried to listen to them and use them to change myself as a person for the better, none of the stuff I talked about here would have ever happened. And I never would have undergone all that character development that would prove so beneficial to me in all aspects of my life. What I eventually realized long after all this happened is that all those people who were being critical of my actions, my behavior, my character, they weren't doing it out of hatred for me or because they thought I was an eminently terrible person. They gave me their criticisms because they recognized that I was a very talented person with a lot of potential, but they also saw some of my more significant character flaws that would prevent me from growing into the person they knew I could become. And when I finally did start listening to them and thinking about how I could try to improve myself as a person, those same people who were so critical of me in the past ended up respecting me and becoming some of my closest friends in the community. I can safely say I would not be the person I am today if not for everyone who tried to help me see the ways in which I could become a better version of myself. And as much as it hurt to take that criticism in the moment, and believe me when I say it did hurt, I can now look back and see how beneficial that ultimately proved to be for me in the long run. And because of that, it is something that I am truly, endlessly thankful for. When people in the community are vocally critical of something about JMR or the people behind the channel, we're not being critical out of spite or hatred or ignorance, but out of love for the channel and the desire to see it be as successful as it can. We all love this channel and everything it's brought into our lives, but at the same time, we recognize things that are holding the channel back and staining its reputation. From a dedicated fan's perspective, there are plenty of very clear, very obvious reasons to be concerned about the direction the channel is heading. And until the channel starts becoming more receptive to those concerns, they're going to have a hard time improving themselves in the way they truly need to if they want to achieve the levels of success they've experienced in the past. And that's not to say that all criticism necessarily comes from a good place, but at the same time, it's disingenuous to say that all criticism comes from a bad place and that none of it is worth considering. Look, I know that criticism isn't always easy to deal with. I dealt with a lot of it in my own past, and I didn't always handle it well. But once I learned how to seriously consider the things people wanted me to change about myself, I ended up undergoing a radical transformation of my character that completely changed the way I conducted myself and the way people perceived me. If I'm capable of doing that, I'd like to believe that JMR would be capable of doing that as well. And if the channel can learn how to meaningfully respond to criticism from the community and fix some of the underlying issues that continue to hold it back, then I would like to believe that perhaps JMR's best days might still be yet to come. That's all I have to say. Thanks for watching.